Drying clothes billow on lines outside of markets. Hundreds of bicycles, salvage parts in different colors, often just taped together, line the sidewalks in busy shopping districts. Neon signs and enormous LCD screens cast an otherworldly glow on middle-aged Tai Chi groups practicing in the middle of the packed Wangfujing Mall. And this is just what you see immediately upon arriving in Beijing. What you may not see right away is what makes this place Mad Max to the core, more than its improvised vehicles ever could, and even more than the seasonal dust storms that plague the city. Beijing is surrounded by industrial provinces which are responsible for much of its pollution, but they're not the only culprit. Perhaps the scariest aspect of Beijing smog is fine particulate matter caused by vehicle emissions. This can penetrate lungs and other organs. City officials put forth a Go Green, Ride the Metro campaign in addition to the multi-billion effort in 2008 to clean things up for the Olympics. But it's just not that simple in a city with 20 million residents and a culture where not having a car is still largely perceived as peasantly. To give you an idea of how this looks, consider that the air quality index in LA on a really bad day is 30. A bad day in Beijing is 300. On a day like this, you can see it within 30 feet of yourself. You can smell it, and you can even taste it. The smog has a flavor, so if you decide to tempt fate and spend time outdoors on a bad day in Beijing, the back of your throat will feel like you've been breathing shaved steel wool, and you will taste aluminum. Yet no one wears masks. At night, when the air cools down and the smog subsides, if you like live indie music and know where you go, you've got options. Though venues open and close on a weekly basis, there's no shortage of dives, basements, and legit... Anyone? What's that?
I don't know.
Anybody? Okay.
No one knows.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll try that one. What the? Kill it.
Yeah, ignore it.
It wants to die. Right. So I'll start with that sentence again. Though venues open and close on a weekly basis, there's no shortage of dives, basements, and legit concert venues to satisfy almost every hankering. China began the process of opening up in the 80s, when decades of Western musical history became available all at once, with no cultural context, making for some very interesting Chinese consequences. Minimal experimental, noise, rockabilly, post-rock, and grunge are also huge in Beijing at the moment. You'd think you were transported back to the 90s, which actually happens to fortuitously sync up with the current 90s revival we're having in America. South by Southwest welcomed 4 of Beijing's most popular indie acts this year. Electronic music is on the rise in Beijing. DJs are flown to play European festivals. New music is constantly being injected into the scene too, in large part thanks to expats, many of whom have found a niche curating, importing, exporting, starting labels, and throwing parties, stirring the culture soup. The idea of musician as revolutionary prevails in China, and alternative music is new in such a way that makes it embody what was now known in America as the rock and roll spirit. Exorbitant censorship, constant intrusive governmental overreach, rampant consumerism, old world nostalgia, and mass denial make for a seemingly endless supply of inspiration. Going mainstream is not the goal, nor an option, which makes for an air of authenticity I find myself missing now that I'm back. In Beijing, bands still have a lot to say. If you're into fashion, chances are you'll be disturbed by the prevalent crocs and inexplicable combinations of colors and patterns commonly worn in Beijing. You'll see groups of men in flip-flops and ill-fitting pants with their shirts rolled up to their nipples, proudly displaying what expats call the Beijing belly. It may be difficult for us to imagine, but expressing oneself through fashion is still a relatively new concept in China. But like everything else here, this is changing every day. In tune with the Beijing 90s sound, the vintage fashion scene is flourishing too. Until recently, wearing used clothing was taboo because it's believed to carry the energy of its previous owners, and also because wearing used clothing was considered exceptionally low class for a long time. These days, when you go to a show, you can expect to find a slew of young people in imported Western vintage fashion. New vintage shops are opening up all the time in upbeat shopping districts like Gulu, and are expanding their stock beyond clothing, introducing the concept of the vintage lifestyle. On the other end of the fashion spectrum, young Beijing designers are challenging traditional ideas of clothing and experimenting with materials, textures, and deconstruction. Could you please pass around those 2 black things? Okay. Thank you. You can just open those up and take a look. Fashion is one creative field where young Chinese can get as out there as they want without worrying much about getting into trouble, so avant-garde fashion is steadily making its way in Beijing. Often with government support. Grants and other programs are available to those who excel in the arts. For my project, we talked with 2 young fashion stars on the rise, and what I'm passing around is one of their lookbooks for this season. Vega Wong's first collection incorporated tech elements. Her second one featured Russian prison tattoos, and now she's exploring a strict neoclassical look, incorporating menswear elements into hyper-structured women's garments. When we met, she had just moved her workshop and staff from a chic modern space into a converted courtyard studio, citing the inability to work in a sterile environment and the need to be surrounded by her favorite things. We spent the afternoon watching spooky stop animation online, talking about how Vega's work continues to be inspired by China, and her unlikely muses, like one assistant to whom she dedicated her entire Russian tattoo season. When I asked Zhang Qi, the guy whose work you're looking at now, the other designer we met with, if I could photograph his gorgeous assistant for a fashion lookbook I was shooting, he gruffly yelled for her to get upstairs now, they want you. Zhang was in the midst of moving into a gleaming white multi-story loft, all metal and crystal chandeliers and helpers fluttering about. His designs are all about extreme cuts and patterns, and his runway shows involve edgy-looking male models in sequin hot pants, thigh-high leather boots, and jewel-encrusted gas masks. When asked what inspired his collection, a smile lit up his chiseled face, and he uttered simply, Diablo. And speaking of the arts, in Beijing, art shows used to be held in secret basements and venues way on the outskirts of town. But now, Chinese art is gaining popularity with Western collectors and is selling at literally thrice of what it went for just a few years ago. Art galleries are clustered into art districts, drawing crowds daily. The most famous of these is the 798 Art Zone, located about 40 minutes from Beijing Center. With close to 300 galleries, shops, and restaurants, this place is a popular destination for locals and tourists, offering lots of exposure to its residents. Though it was once the premier location to set up shop for budding artists, most are now choosing less public, glitzy, and hectic environments for their studios. Privacy is another Western concept being adapted in China these days, formerly carrying negative connotations of secrecy and mistrust. Chinese pop art of the past decade is sometimes criticized for its kitschy attitudes, but when you consider the extreme consumerist culture of the growing middle class, you begin to see where such dismissal might be short-sighted. Still, the red cookie-cutter mouths and giant bobble-headed babies in communist caps are giving way to a more diverse art scene, which includes everything from subtle conceptual work to perfect polished future glitz. The Beijing pop aesthetic is now being shaped by people like Chen Man, one of China's most renowned fashion photographers, with a dozen ID magazine covers and a MAC campaign under her belt. She's married to an American, and her work is heavily influenced by Western sci-fi and fantasy imagery. Simultaneously, she's intensely patriotic, and during our interview, she spoke about her desire to change perceptions about China worldwide. She injects her passions into China's most prevalent advertising campaigns. Her colorful space girls, warrior women, and cartoon princesses are seen on billboards and magazines and by hundreds of thousands of Beijingers every day. Though I didn't have the chance to explore as much of the alternative art scene as I wanted, my favorite experience was an impromptu visit to a place called Iowa. Some years ago, Ai Weiwei, a controversial conceptual artist and designer you might have heard of, moved to the Kaohsiung neighborhood about an hour away from the city center and set up Fake, his design studio. Now, an entire district has sprung up around it, with gorgeous minimal brick buildings designed by Ai himself. It's filling up with galleries, co-ops, and artist lofts. And just outside Iowa, a group of greenhouses converted into work studios and living spaces with corn growing all around. I spent a few hours here, first indulging in a casual tea ceremony with a professional artist-interpreter, and later with a lovely couple of sculptors who were in possession of a giant Ai Weiwei puppet. Another facet of the Beijing contemporary art experience is the work of photographer Ren Hang. Can you pass the book around?
It's going, yeah.
Oh, okay. Some of you are looking, if you don't like penis, please don't look at that book. I was asked to warn everyone. There's nudity. There's nipples also. And I don't, possibly worse. Who knows? Ren Hang's work is intentionally lo-fi, and his backgrounds are not expensive studios, but essential Beijing, from decrepit suburbs and dodgy hotels to lush greenery and heart-stopping skylines. The photos oscillate between obscene erotica and delicate symbolism, encapsulating the hope and anxiety of his time. He's gaining popularity and has this book that came out in France, but can't seem to get a show in Beijing. He generously orchestrated a photo shoot for us to film in one of the creepiest hotels I've ever had the pleasure of visiting. It was just our little film crew, 2 nude models, the photographer, and 2 live doves. After several hours of watching him work, I couldn't resist and asked Ren to shoot me too. I spent the next week nursing some pretty nasty pigeon scratches on one of my nipples, but you know what? Totally worth it. So what is the 2012 Beijing aesthetic? It's new culture, being born out of thousands of years of tradition, mixed with rapid global exposure, flourishing in spite of and spurred by oppression. It's space girls and Beijing bellies and avant-garde. It's a generational and economic gaps caused by evolution and fast forward, and people learning to establish themselves amidst the chaos. It's entrepreneurs cashing in on the bubble while they can. It's the thought police of 1984 and the grunge scene of 1996. It's families living on $1 a day on neon castles and undrinkable tap water in avant-garde fashion. It's the aesthetic of a capital of a proud country that knows it will go far, but for now is a very big place with a lot of very poor people. And it's people who fall in love and stay there, learning to treasure every aspect of a transitioning nation. That's it.